Good morning, Tobago. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. Good morning, all of you out there in the diaspora. Thank you for joining me this morning for a briefing that will hopefully be an exercise in educating Tobagonians and some public officials, it will seem, about how the Tobago House of Assembly works and how Act 40 of 1996 is intended to be interpreted. More so, this is, I think, a beautiful opportunity for me to start the work week with you, Tobagonians, and just saying that I wish that this week we have a very productive week ahead. This morning, there are a couple of things I will go through with you that will bring an abundance of clarity for you. Firstly, I will go through how an executive council is constituted. Secondly, I will look at how a secretary is appointed. Then I will look at the actual oath taken by secretaries, assistant secretaries, the deputy chief secretary, and the chief secretary. It is the same oath essentially, and it's important I show you that oath so you understand to what oath is the President of the Republic appointing secretaries, assistant secretaries, deputy chief secretary, and the chief secretaries. Then I'll go through how duties are assigned to a secretary. And then I will go through what happens when a secretary is out of office. I will then go through the initial temporary appointment of Secretary Hackett, and then on to the current appointment for Secretary Hackett and Secretary Boris. Then I'll go through what the powers of a secretary, what are those powers of a secretary. And finally, I will end by looking at the duties of the chief administrator and administrators. So you see not just how the executive is formed, the powers of members of the executive, and how their duties are assigned, but also how the chief administrator and administrators are so assigned and their duties. And so we start with how the Executive Council is constituted. And this morning I wish, for those of you who are looking on, you will get the opportunity of actually viewing on screen excerpts from Act 40 of 1996. So we start with the composition of the Executive Council, which is found in section 33(1) of Act 40 of 1996, which essentially says that the Executive Council shall comprise the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, thirdly, such other secretaries not being more than 7, selected from among members of the Assembly, as the President, acting in accordance with the advice of the Chief Secretary, may appoint. The Chief Secretary shall consult with members before he advises the President in accordance with subsection 1C, and the President shall administer to a Secretary the oath set out in the 3rd schedule. Essentially what this means is that for there to be an Executive Council, you must start with 2 named office holders. 1, the Chief Secretary, and secondly, the Deputy Chief Secretary. Those 2 are mandatory. And then the Chief Secretary gets to appoint no more than 7 others. So in other words, there should be 9 members of the Executive Council, or there are 9 members of the Executive Council maximum. It's important to note that a Chief Secretary could decide to only appoint 5 other secretaries, or maybe 2 other secretaries, or even no other secretaries, and just reserve the duties primarily to the Chief Secretary and the Deputy Chief Secretary. It really and truly boils down to the decision of the Chief Secretary, who advises the President of the appointment, and he advises the President of the appointment after, of course, consulting with members. So the Chief Secretary can't just appoint a member as a secretary without first talking to that person and other members of the team. That's just how it works. So essentially, we have an Executive Council at present that comprises myself, Deputy Chief Secretary Dr. Faith Bremner, and 7 other secretaries. 7 other secretaries. Those 7 other secretaries are Secretary Tasha Boris, Secretary Zorisha Hackett, Secretary Ian Pollard, Secretary Trevor James, Secretary Wayne Clark, Secretary, who am I forgetting? That's 5 others. We have the Secretary Pantin across at Food Security, and there is one other to make 7. Forgive me. I already indicated Secretary Hackett. So we have education, tourism, food security. We also have community development, youth development and sport. We have works and infrastructure. We have tourism as part of the package. And so that's essentially the Executive Council and we have settlements, which will be Mr. Pollard, Ian Pollard. That's essentially the 7 plus the Deputy Chief Secretary and myself. That's the current Executive Council. So let's look at how a secretary is appointed. Well, essentially, I just went through that. Essentially, the Chief Secretary decides from among the members of the House, who he wishes to appoint as secretaries. And just for information, the Chief Secretary can actually pick a member who is not even part of his party to be a secretary. I could wake up in the morning if I wish and decide I am going to appoint someone in the minority bench as a secretary. The law allows for that. And then its constitution in terms of its duties and powers. We go to section 34.1, and this speaks to how the duties of a secretary are assigned. It says the Executive Council shall be responsible for carrying out the functions of the Assembly, and the Chief Secretary may, for that purpose, undertake or assign a secretary responsibility for such function. And I want to pause there. In other words, when the Executive Council is formed, the Chief Secretary may decide, for the purpose of carrying out functions of the executive, to assign a secretary responsibility for any such function, and this will be any function listed in the 5th schedule. The Chief Secretary just decides who he will appoint as secretary, and secondly, the Chief Secretary decides what those duties are for each secretary. The Chief Secretary can decide to give 1 duty, he can give 2, he can give 5, he can give all 33. In other words, the Chief Secretary has the sole responsibility of deciding what the duties and functions are for a secretary. And as you can see in section 34.1, it says that for the carrying out of the functions of the Assembly, that the Chief Secretary may, for that purpose, undertake or assign a secretary. May being operational here, being the operative word here, means that the Chief Secretary may assign duties or he may not assign such duties in the law. 34.2 says, in the exercise of their powers, the members of the Executive Council shall be individually and collectively responsible to the Assembly. And this is just a matter of collective responsibility, which is given in any executive. The same applies to the cabinet in Trinidad. 34.3 says, subject to subsection 2, decisions of the Executive Council may be implemented without prior approval of the Assembly. In other words, the Executive Council can sit, make decisions, and actually execute those decisions without having to go to the Assembly for prior approval. In other words, it is not required that every decision that the government here in the Tobago House of Assembly has to implement, that it has to go before the Assembly in order for it to be carried out or in order for it to be approved. It can be approved at the Executive Council. And since 1996, Executive Councils have been approving directives via Executive Council minutes. Subsection 4 says the Executive Council shall continue to discharge its functions during any period that the assembly stands dissolved. In other words, at the point where the assembly is dissolved in preparation for a new election, the executive council continues to discharge its functions. It continues to work. Now, I want to show you what the appointment of a secretary looks like. And this is what was issued to all secretaries. And this sample is from Secretary Zorisha Hackett, or given to Assemblyman Zorisha Hackett. It says, in the exercise of the powers vested in me by section 141A of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and section 33(1)(c) of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, chapter 2503, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Chief Secretary, hear it again, do hereby appoint you, Zorisha Hackett, a secretary in the Executive Council of the Tobago House of Assembly. And I want to leave this on the screen because it's important for you to appreciate that when a secretary is appointed, unlike when a minister is appointed, a secretary is not appointed to a division. A secretary is appointed in the Executive Council. And it is the duty of the Chief Secretary to assign functions thereafter if he so chooses. The Chief Secretary can assign functions for the entire 4-year period. He could assign it for 3 months. He can assign it for 2 years. He can move secretaries around as he deems necessary for the proper functioning of the Tobago House of Assembly. In other words, once a member has this oath, whereby they are sworn or affirmed to be a secretary in the Executive Council, it is then the role of the Chief Secretary to decide how he uses the secretary. I know many people out there, after hearing some of the nonsense being peddled over the last week and a half, might be thinking that when the president gives the oath, that secretaries are sworn to a division, that perhaps the Chief Secretary needs to go back to the president if he has to reassign duties. No, that does not exist in the Tobago House of Assembly. The president's role in the Tobago House of Assembly begins and ends with the issuing of oaths. That's it. The president has no real function in the day-to-day operations of the Tobago House of Assembly. Once that oath is given to a secretary, save and except if the Chief Secretary is removing or changing a secretary, then the Chief Secretary simply needs to move his secretaries around as he deems necessary and assign or reassign duties as he deems necessary. So that's essentially how that works. That's the oath. And by the way, this oath is taken by secretaries, assistant secretaries. This is the general oath that is laid out in the 3rd schedule of Act 40 of 1996. Chief Secretary, Deputy Chief Secretary, Secretary and Assistant Secretary, we essentially all take the same oath, save and except that we will change the title of the office as the oath is being read. Now, it is important to understand that as the Chief Secretary assigned duties, the Chief Secretary has essentially free rein in how we assign those duties. There are no limitations in how he assigned those duties. And so we'll go through how the duties are assigned. The Chief Secretary essentially assigned the duties by way of simply in writing indicating to a member that is appointed as a secretary what their duties are. It's not a word of mouth thing. The Chief Secretary doesn't just say to someone, oh, these are your duties. Well, certainly not this Chief Secretary. It is placed in writing for the Secretary. So the Secretary understands fully what their roles and their functions are. And it's important to understand that at any given moment, without requiring not even consultation in this instance, the chief secretary can reassign the functions. Consultation is only required before the chief secretary appoints a secretary, but it is not required for the assigning or reassigning of functions. So what happens when a secretary is out of office? Now, and I want to explain something. Throughout this administration, whenever a secretary is out of office for whatever reason, one out of two things happen. Is either the chief secretary appoints someone else to act for the duration, or the chief secretary himself takes up the function. Now, I hear some people in this space saying that the law is silent about what should happen if a secretary is not available. But it's not that the law is silent. The law has already empowered the chief secretary to assign and reassign duties and functions without having to go back to the president. So, if a secretary is hospitalized, and that has happened since we have been in office, the chief secretary simply assigns the duties to someone else temporarily, or the chief secretary will do the work. And that has happened many times. In the instance, for example, when former Secretary Sampson became Member of Parliament, for a short period, all of the duties were being taken up by the Chief Secretary himself. It wasn't assigned to anyone else for that period. Recently, when the Secretary of Finance was in Japan, for the period when she was in Japan, the duties as Secretary of Finance was actually assigned to Secretary Pantin. That is not uncommon, that is not unusual. That's just the powers the Chief Secretary has in organizing the Secretariat for the functioning of the Tobago House of Assembly. And so it's not that the law is silent, but the law already gave the Chief Secretary a mechanism through which he can, in fact, assign those duties. I wish to look at what the powers of a secretary, what those powers are. And those are really listed in section 37.1. And it's written quite generally. It says, where a secretary is assigned responsibility for a division of the assembly, he shall exercise general direction and control over that division. And I think what is confusing some people in this space is what's really the legal definition of the word where. Where here, when you look at legal drafting, simply means if or once that situation exists. So in other words, I could actually have a secretary to which he or she is not assigned to any division at all. The person could be a secretary at large, a secretary that's just a secretary and not assigned to a division. But the law is saying once a secretary is assigned responsibility for a division of the assembly, he shall exercise general direction and control over that division. Now, some people are trying to interpret this literally to say that this means only one secretary could be assigned duties that are a part of a division. The law does not say that, actually. This does not mean that there shall only be one secretary assigned to duties that are under the review or the purview, rather, of a division. That's not what this is saying. This is simply saying once a secretary is assigned responsibility for a division of the assembly, he shall exercise general direction and control over that division. And please, let me warn those opposite that he here doesn't just mean he. If you look at the Interpretation Act in section 16, which is a piece of law that simply says this is how all our laws ought to be interpreted. Section 16 of the Interpretation Act actually says that where the singular is, the same, where a rule applies to the singular, it applies to the plural. And where you see he, it also means she, and also them as a cooperative. That's section 16 of the Interpretation Act. And it says, nothing in this act shall affect mutual consultation between a minister and a secretary. So in other words, secretaries are allowed to meet with ministers. Secretaries are allowed to have partnerships and collaborations with ministers. So you may have seen Secretary of Education meet with the Minister of Education. You may have seen the Secretary of Tourism meet with the Minister of Tourism, and so on and so forth. Secretary of Settlements had meeting with the Minister of Planning not so long ago. The Secretary of Finance met with the Minister of Finance about a week or two ago. So that's normal, and that is expected under the law. Now, let's go to the issue of the chief administrator and the administrators and what their duties are. It says that there shall be assigned to the assembly a chief administrator who shall be a public officer for the purposes of section 121 of the Constitution. And upon the coming into force of this act, all the rights, privileges, and conditions of service incidental to the office of clerk of the former assembly shall be transferred to the office of the chief administrator without any break in service. What happened prior to 1996 is that the clerk of the assembly acted as the chief administrator essentially, was the one who signed and stamped documents. So if you have ever had, for example, a lease from the THA, one of the signatures you will see will be that of the chief administrator. Contracts, you will see the chief administrator's signature. Prior to 1996, the clerk of the assembly was the one that performed such a role. But those were transferred without any break in service to the chief administrator's office as of December in 1996. Thirdly, the chief administrator shall be an accounting officer who shall be responsible for such division as may be assigned to him by the chief secretary. Many of you don't know that it is the duty of the chief secretary to assign the chief administrator to a division. It is not a guarantee that the chief administrator must be in the office of the chief secretary. So for all intents and purposes, I could simply leave this press conference and immediately instruct the chief administrator to report for duty in another division and have another administrator placed here at the office of the chief secretary. It is within the powers of the chief secretary to assign the division to the chief administrator. Subsection 4 says, prior to consultation with the Public Service Commission on the appointment of the chief administrator, the Prime Minister shall consult with the chief secretary. And remember that there was some conflict when we were appointing someone to act in the role of chief administrator the last time around, whereby I contended that there was an attempt to appoint a chief administrator without consulting with me. And I was prepared to go to court and stop any such appointment if the appointment occurred without due consultation with me. So that's the duties of the chief administrator. The clerk of the assembly now shall be assigned to the assembly a clerk who shall be responsible for the efficient discharge of such functions as fall to be discharged by him under the rules and standing orders of the assembly, or as may be assigned to him by the presiding officer. In other words, the presiding officer is in charge of the assembly legislature. The clerk of the assembly now is responsible for discharging such duties under the rules and standing orders of the assembly, or will have to carry out any other function that may be assigned to the clerk by the presiding officer. So what the secretary is to a division, the presiding officer is to the assembly legislature. And upon the coming into force of this act, all rights, privileges, and conditions of service incidental to the office of secretary of the former assembly shall be transferred to the clerk of the assembly without any break in service. So what was previously secretary to the former assembly is now clerk of the assembly. So why did I take the time, or duties of an administrator? Sorry. That is found in section 73. It says, each division of the assembly shall be under the supervision of an administrator who shall be of a level no lower than that of a chief technical officer, and who shall be the accounting officer of the division under his supervision. Now, something is strange here, because the law is saying that in each division it shall fall under the supervision of an administrator. In other words, an administrator is to be assigned to a division. Here at the office of the chief secretary, we have both the chief administrator and an administrator. And that's because we have more administrators than we have divisions. If we are to add the chief administrator plus 9 administrators, we have 10 accounting officers in total, and we can have no more than 9 secretaries. That includes chief secretary, deputy chief secretary, and 7 others. But here in the office of the chief secretary, we have the chief administrator and an administrator. And there is nothing illegal about that. So not because we see in the law, it says under the supervision of an administrator, it means that it will be illegal for an administrator to also serve where there is the chief administrator or another administrator for that matter. It's quite similar to ministries in Trinidad. Some ministries in Trinidad carry more than 1 permanent secretaries, more than 1 deputy permanent secretaries. The law allows for that, and it should not be taken, this should not be construed into meaning that only 1 administrator should be assigned duties to a division. Now, what brought us to this point? On September 15th, Secretary Boris indicated that for the week of September 15th, and excuse me, let me have some water. Secretary Boris asked of the Chief Secretary for leave of absence for the week of September 15th. As a matter of fact, the Sunday where we had the unfortunate injury and death in the nylon pool, Secretary Boris was actually supposed to be on a flight to Trinidad, where she was scheduled to spend the week. Both Secretary Boris and I ended up in the Gibson Jetty area, sorting the matter out. And I eventually said to Secretary Boris, listen, you applied for leave, you go on leave, and I'll have this covered. I met with Secretary Boris the Friday prior. So this happened, the death and injury happened on Sunday. The Friday prior, I met with Secretary Boris. Secretary Boris took a leave on Sunday, and she, as I indicated, she asked for the time off for the week of the 15th. As it is my duty under law, the responsibility will now fall on either the Chief Secretary or for the Chief Secretary to assign the duties to someone else. In that week, while that was happening, I was trying to also meet with the carnival stakeholders, trying to see what's happening down at Festival Commission and why they are not paying their stakeholders. And I said, look, this is too much. At this time, Secretary Hackett had already completed her school repairs. School is reopened. Things are running smoothly there. And so I assigned temporarily the duties of the division to Secretary Hackett. That's for the first week. By the end of the week, and I did so in writing, and I copied Administrator Trim, Chief Administrator Toby Quashie, Secretary Boris, Assistant Secretary Niall George, and the chairmen of all of the companies, all of the boards of the companies under the Division of Tourism, culture, antiquities, and transportation. So temporarily for that week, the duties were assigned to Secretary Hackett. As we were coming out of the week, and I'm getting the weekly report from Secretary Hackett, and seeing the work that was done, and the work that is required, and what she was able to do and not do, and then having had a conversation with the stakeholders for the Tobago October Carnival, this Chief Secretary decided that he will reassign some of the duties from Secretary Hackett to, from Secretary Boris to Secretary Hackett. So I reassigned in writing, not word of mouth, the duties for antiquities and culture to Secretary Hackett, and Secretary Boris remains with the duties for tourism and transportation. Guess what? I am legally authorized so to do. I can give duties to anybody temporarily for any length of time, any amount of duties. I am so authorized to do in law. There is nothing illegal about that. There is nothing illegal about that. I am authorized, if I so choose, to split the duties of a division and to remove some from under one secretary and assign those duties with the full powers of Section 37(1) to another secretary. And so what I have done is that I have assigned the duties for antiquities and culture to Secretary Hackett, and I have indicated to both Secretary Hackett and Secretary Boris that I'm doing this temporarily, and that at a time of my choosing, I will revoke those duties from being under the purview of Secretary Hackett. I am so legally authorized. I don't need permission of anybody to do that. I don't need to consult with the minority to do that. In fact, I don't even need to consult with members of the executive to do that. But prior to doing so, at the last executive council meeting, which wasn't last week because last week was a holiday, the week before, that was placed in the discussion, and I placed it in writing. So this is not a word of mouth thing. We didn't just get up one morning and say, Secretary Hackett, take somebody work. No. I assigned and reassigned the duties as I deemed it necessary for ensuring the proper functioning of the Tobago House of Assembly. And that is my right in law. There is nothing illegal about that. So essentially, as it now stands, Secretary Hackett has responsibility for duties for education, for research, for technology, for antiquities and culture. Secretary Boris has responsibilities for tourism, and she has responsibilities for transportation. Now, I know what your next question is, and I don't want anybody here unnecessarily passing their mouths, and I'm using the colloquial terms, on Secretary Boris. Because here is the reality. Secretary Boris has a duty that is perhaps harder than most. She has a duty to take peanuts allocations and to find a way to market the destination, keep Tobago relevant in the eyes of international stakeholders where tourism is concerned, and get airlift to the island. When we came out of COVID, in fact, we took office in December 9th. Secretaries received their instruments on December 9th, I think, December 9th, 2021. When we took office, this is the reality. When we took office, there were next to no domestic flights, and there were no international flights. That's the reality. In January, we were able to get the return of BA. Then we added Condor. Then we added a direct route between Barbados and Tobago. Then we had the added New York to Tobago direct. All of those things happen under the auspices of Secretary Boris. And I know for a fact that she is working on having some additional flights coming to the island between now and year end. And that requires a lot of heavy lifting. I know that. I know that when we don't have enough money for marketing, the cheaper and the cheapest thing to do is to actually pick people up and carry them to different destinations, as we did in New York, as we did in Toronto, as is done in London and in Germany, as a way of getting people in that market actually interested in flying to Tobago. The reality is that when our nearest competitor is spending 40 million US dollars on marketing, Tobago is spending about 7 million US for all of its operations. That's paying staff, paying for marketing, paying for airlift, and paying for everything that tourism needs. And people expect us to compete on an even keel. And so Secretary Boris will focus on tourism and transportation at this time. And until further notice from me or from my office, Secretary Hackett will assume the duties for antiquities and culture. There is nothing in the law that prohibits me from splitting or dissecting an already established division in such a manner. This is not a legal issue really and truly. It's really an administrative issue. And that is one for the chief and the administrators to perhaps work out if there is need to do that. But I can recall when we came into office and when the divisions were aligned or realigned, as is the case in every government. You know when those vote books actually made its way to ComDev from the then Division of Youth, a whole next fiscal year. Because at the time when I came into office, Koroma was acting as chief ad, and she advised, look, it's not possible, it's almost impossible to move vote books and line items around in the middle of the financial year. So we'll wait until the new financial year to have it fully aligned. So although then Deputy Chief Secretary, Mr. Duke, was working down at Shaw Park, where the old division of youth and sport was, guess what? He was down there, and there was not a single vote book or line item assigned to that division of the Deputy Chief Secretary for an entire fiscal year until the new fiscal year started. Because that is a mere administrative issue. It's not really a legal issue. And so I will conclude by saying this, that, a purposive interpretation of the Act would suggest that the provisions of the Act are arranged in a manner to empower the Chief Secretary to manage the various portfolios of the THA by the assignment of responsibilities to various secretaries in a way that the Chief Secretary sees fit. The principle of effectiveness applies, which is a principle of statutory interpretation that ensures statutes are interpreted in a manner to give practical effect to the provisions. It could never have been the intention of Parliament, which is the touchstone test of statutory interpretation, to stymie or to hinder the ability of the Chief Secretary to manage the portfolios assigned to the THA by locking them into a static arrangement. That is actually inconsistent with common sense, effectiveness, and the plain words of the Act. Now, I've been hearing Mr. Ansel Dennis talking about this issue, but the reality is Mr. Dennis, who was Chief Secretary for 581 days, has neither the legal expertise nor the experience to advise anybody on how the THA ought to function and how it ought to be run. And that is evidenced by the nonsensical claims that he has been making with regards to the responsibilities assigned to Secretary Hackett that were previously under the full remit of Secretary Boris. The THA Act provides for the position of secretary and describes a secretary, I'm just concluding now, a secretary as a member of the Executive Council to whom administrative responsibility may be assigned or reassigned. The Act doesn't limit the amount of responsibilities assigned to a secretary. It does not prescribe how responsibilities are to be assigned, nor does it stipulate that secretaries cannot be assigned responsibilities in a cross-divisional manner. It does not say so. And as such, no sensible person could suggest that the assignment of additional fifth schedule responsibilities to Secretary Hackett is contrary to the Tobago House of Assembly Act. In fact, I find it telling that while Dennis complains, he does not threaten to obtain an interpretation summons or to seek the assistance of the court in putting this so-called wrong right. So clearly this is just silly season and people choosing to be silly to the highest. There ought to be no confusion. And I would like to think that if someone aspires to be chief secretary, the first thing they must aspire to do is to read the THA Act and to understand what are the powers assigned to a chief secretary. And so, with the powers that have been assigned to me on the day I took the oath as chief secretary, I duly reassigned some of the portfolio that was originally assigned to Secretary Boris, to Secretary Hackett. And to be clear, let me say what they are again. As of now, until further notice from me, Secretary Hackett takes responsibility for antiquities and culture. Secretary Boris retains responsibility for tourism and for transportation. And I'll end on this example. Many of you may not be aware that since you have been in office, that the Department of Environment, what is traditionally known as DNRE, Department of Natural Resources and the Environment, that department now resides under the office of the Chief Secretary. Because about 2 years ago, with advice from the IDB, I reassigned that department to being under the auspices of the office of the Chief Secretary. The name of the Division of Food Security has not changed because that's an administrative issue. There's a cost to changing letterheads and changing logos and so on, and that's not necessary. But the department has resided under the office of the Chief Secretary for almost 2 years. There is nothing illegal about that. That's what the law allows for. And I hope that this brings clarity. I am grateful for the opportunity to have brought some education to the people of Tobago. And hopefully those opposites who have been walking around talking nonsense will learn a thing or two. At this time, if there are questions from members of the media, I will take those questions. All right, so I'm seeing no indication of hands. And usually, as a teacher, when you finish a lesson and you see no indication of hands, usually it means that the lesson was well taught and it is understood by all. I want to thank members of the media for joining us this morning. Thank you to Tobagonians for listening. And please, wherever you are, the Act 40 of 1996 is actually available online. It is available online. Download it. Print a copy. Keep it in your homes. Read it as often as you can. Understand how the THA works. Understand that the THA may not always work in the same way as it works in Trinidad. So, for example, in the central government, if the Prime Minister wants to reassign ministerial duties, she goes back to the President. If she has to assign temporary duties, she goes through the President. To assign Ms. Jolene John to act as Prime Minister, she goes through the President. Guess what? In the THA, there is no need in the law to go back to the President for anything when it comes to the assigning of duties or reassigning of duties where secretaries are concerned. And so Secretary Boris remains a secretary at this time. and she remains the secretary with responsibility for tourism and transportation. Secretary Hackett adopts the responsibilities for antiquities and culture, and she will continue to assume those duties until there is indication from me that there's a revocation of such duties. Thank you. God bless you. Please have a productive week ahead. I'm certain this will not be the last time you hear from me this week. Several very important things are happening during the week. One of the things that my office is treating with this week is the water issue and the water crisis on island. I am having the CEO of WASA coming to the island on Wednesday because WASA have to fix this problem for us. We are supposed to be in the rainy season, and if we're having problems, especially in the western, southwestern parts of the island now, God alone knows what will happen for the dry season. So we're looking at some solutions to that this week. I'm leaving the office in a short while to go do a site visit at the CERT building that we are trying to complete in Speyside. The monies for that building was gifted by the Japanese. And here's a fun fact. I was at the CERT turning as just an area representative and minority assemblyman. This was before COVID, perhaps about a year before COVID, or a year and a half before COVID. And COVID came, and all these years passed, but I'm happy that we are finally at a point where we'll be able to get that building finished and handed over to TEMA for their functioning, and that should happen in a week or two time. So I'm doing a site visit there today. Also in this week you will continue to hear from Secretary Hackett and the team, the working team of stakeholders, about what's happening with the carnival and how that is progressing. It's important to appreciate that you do have a chief secretary that listens to you, because I listened to the stakeholders carefully. I sat in meetings with you all. I heard the challenges that you all were having and so on, and I reassigned duties accordingly for greater efficiency and effectiveness. And I can see already that it is working in your favor. Please, we will not allow anybody to dampen our spirits. This week, be safe. Have a productive week ahead. Have a very productive week ahead, please. And again, as I said, I'm sure you will hear from me later this week, especially as I'm trying to intervene with this water crisis that we are seeing in some parts of the island. Thank you, and God's richest blessings.